Will Smith is one of the rare names in the history of American entertainment who has successfully conquered all three fields: music, television, and film. Starting as a young rapper with DJ Jazzy Jeff, he quickly won his first Grammy for the rap category in 1989, opening a new era for mainstream hip-hop. Before transitioning to television with the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the show not only saved him from the brink of financial ruin, but also turned him into a familiar face in every American household. From there, he moved straight into Hollywood with a series of blockbusters like Independence Day, Men in Black, Ali, and The Pursuit of Happiness works that not only grossed hundreds of millions of dollars, but also earned him multiple Oscar nominations before he officially won the prestigious Golden Statue with King Richard. He became one of the few artists who possesses both an Oscar and multiple Grammys, while maintaining his status as a box office star for more than 3 decades, a symbol of success, of perseverance, of the American dream that millions of people believe if they try hard enough, they can also reach. But behind all those achievements is a man who has never truly been able to rest, a man who learned to smile before he learned to face pain, who built a perfect version of himself for the world to love while keeping the most vulnerable parts in silence. He lives 2 parallel lives, one in front of the camera where everything is complete, and one behind it where he struggles with pressure, with childhood memories, with the feeling of never being good enough, where every decision carries the fear of losing everything. And it is in that inner conflict that his will does not lie in becoming perfect, but in continuing to stand firm, even though he knows there are still cracks inside him that have never truly been healed. Before continuing on the journey behind that smile, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a quiet way to acknowledge a person who has had to be strong for too long. And if you have ever wondered what really hides behind those perfect smiles, stay with us, because the next part of the story will not be like anything you have ever believed about him. But to understand why a person like Will Smith had to learn to smile so early, one must go back to where it all began, a house in Philadelphia, where there was not always laughter, but was often covered by a heavy atmosphere that was hard to name. A family that from the outside looked stable, disciplined, and principled, but inside had cracks that a child should never have to witness. Will's father was a strict man who worked hard, but he also carried uncontrollable anger. He believed in absolute discipline and that the family must operate under rigid rules, and any deviation needed to be corrected. But the way he corrected was not with gentle words, but with imposition, with outbursts of rage that could erupt at any moment, making the house a place where everyone always had to be cautious, always had to anticipate his emotions to avoid an upcoming storm. Meanwhile, Will's mother, a gentle and devoted woman, chose silence. She endured more than she resisted, keeping everything from completely falling apart by suppressing herself. And that very silence, although meant to protect, unintentionally taught the children in the house another lesson, that there are pains that are not allowed to be spoken, that there are emotions that must be hidden to keep everything looking normal from the outside. In that house, speaking up was not always encouraged, and emotions were not always accepted. There were evenings when everything became too quiet, a silence that did not bring peace, but made people feel even more tense, as if any sound could break a fragile state. And in those moments, Will, as a little boy, learned to observe, learned to read situations before speaking, learned to adjust himself so as not to become the cause of a new conflict. He was not the noisy child in that house, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that speaking out sometimes did not help and could even make things worse. So he chose to hold back his emotions, hold back his thoughts, hold back the questions that no one answered. And gradually, holding back became a habit, a reflex, a part of how he existed. Instead of showing fear, he learned to hide it. Instead of reacting to pain, he learned to avoid it. In the eyes of others, he might have looked like an obedient, well-behaved child who did not cause trouble. But inside, he was a child trying to figure out how the world worked in an environment where safety was never fully guaranteed. He began to understand that stability was not a given, that love did not always come with gentleness, and that sometimes, to keep everything from breaking, people had to accept silence. And it was in those years that an important part of Will was formed, not from joyful moments, but from long silences, from times when he stood still observing instead of participating, from times when he chose not to speak instead of speaking up. And the saddest thing was not that he had gone through those things, but that he had gotten used to it, used to having to control himself to fit the environment around him, used to putting other people's feelings before his own. And when a child grows up in such circumstances, he not only learns to survive, but also learns to become a version of himself that the world finds more acceptable. A version that does not cause trouble, does not make things awkward, does not force anyone to face what they do not want to see. Over time, the line between his true self and the self he had to become began to blur, not because he wanted to change, but because that was the only way he knew to survive in a house where silence was sometimes safer than the truth. And then there was one night when everything was no longer just confusing silences or simmering tensions, but became a clear, sharp memory moment that a child could never forget. A night that Will Smith would later carry like a cut that never heals. The house was still the same, with the familiar walls and the small sounds of a family trying to keep everything stable. But there was something in the air signaling that the quiet was only temporary, that a storm was approaching, and when it happened, it did not come with initial noise, but with a change in tone, a different nuance in the way of speaking, something that a child like Will had learned to recognize very early. He knew what it meant. He knew he should stay silent, should stand still, should do nothing. But this time, things went further than anything he had witnessed before. The conflict between his father and mother no longer stopped at words or heavy glances, but became a concrete action, a moment when his father hurt his mother right in front of him. There was no preparation, no time to think, only a truth that happened too fast and too real to deny. And in that moment, time seemed to slow down, not because everything actually stopped, but because a child's mind could not keep up with what was happening. Will stood there, seeing everything, feeling everything, but he did not move, did not say anything, did not intervene. Not because he did not care, but because he did not know what to do, because fear held him back, because he had learned that confronting could make things worse, because he was just a child in a situation beyond his ability. And then that moment passed. Everything gradually calmed down, and the house returned to its familiar silence. But nothing was truly the same again, because inside Will, something had changed permanently. Not just the memory of what he had seen, but the way he understood himself from that point onward. The feeling of guilt did not come gradually, but hit him immediately. Like a conclusion he drew before anyone could say anything, that he had not done the right thing, that he had failed, that in the most important moment, he had not protected the person he loved. And for a child, such thoughts were not questions to be answered, but became beliefs that took root so deeply that they followed him throughout his adult years. From then on, whenever he thought about strength, about the role of a man, about protecting his family, Will did not only think about what he should do, but about what he had not done. And that memory did not just stay in his mind as an image, but became part of how he viewed the world, a standard he imposed on himself, that he must be stronger, must control better, must never let that happen again. But the most painful thing was not that he had stood still, but that he could not change it, could not go back, could not fix it. And so he carried it like an unpaid debt, a feeling that there was always a part of him that was missing, that was never enough. Over time, that memory did not disappear, but only changed form. It appeared in big and small decisions, in the way he reacted to conflict, in the way he tried to protect those around him. sometimes excessively, sometimes by controlling, sometimes by not allowing himself to be vulnerable, because deep inside, he was still the child of that night, still standing there, still seeing everything, still feeling that he had not done enough. And no matter how the world later saw a successful, strong, confident man, for Will himself, there always existed a memory reminding him that there had been a moment in his life when he did not become the person he thought he should have been. And that very memory, quietly but persistently, had accompanied him through every stage of his life, shaping not only his actions but also the way he felt about himself, like an echo that never fades. From after that night, Will Smith no longer looked at the world the way a normal child would. He began searching for a different way to exist, a way where he could control what was happening around him without having to confront it directly. And school became the place where he tested that out, not through strength or resistance, but through humor, through the ability to make others laugh at exactly the moment when everything risked becoming tense. He quickly realized something that later became a guiding principle in his life, that when people laugh, they will not be angry. When they laugh, they will not attack. And in that laughter, he could create a safe space for himself. A space where he was no longer the powerless child standing in the corner of the room, but the one controlling the emotions of the entire room. From then on, being the class clown was not just a role in the classroom, but became part of his identity. He talked more, joked more, observed people more carefully to know when to slip in a joke, when to ease the atmosphere, when to shift everyone's attention away from what could cause conflict. And each time the whole class burst out laughing, he felt as if he had just prevented something bad, as if he were fixing a part of the past he could not change. But what no one noticed, and perhaps he himself did not notice right away, was that making others laugh gradually became the only way he felt he had value. Not because he was truly happy, but because it was the only way he knew to be accepted, to not be abandoned, to not have to face the tension he had become so familiar with since childhood. Over time, the line between him performing and him living began to blur. He built a version of himself that was always positive, always energetic, always bringing good energy to others. A version everyone liked and wanted to be around. But that version did not contain his entire self. It was only the part he chose to show, while the other parts, the parts related to fear, to insecurity, to the feeling of not being good enough, were kept hidden, pushed deep inside where no one could see and no one was allowed to touch. And as time went on, he became more and more used to putting other people's emotions before his own, used to reading the room before speaking, used to adjusting himself to fit what others expected, to the point that stopping to ask himself what he really felt became foreign, because that had never been the priority. His priority was always to keep everything stable, to keep everyone comfortable, to keep conflict from happening. And in that process, a clear difference began to form between the person everyone saw and the person he truly was. One side was the smile, the confidence, the ability to master every situation, while the other side was unanswered questions, unnamed emotions, a child still trying to understand what had happened to him and why he always felt he had to do more, be better, be stronger to make up for one moment in the past. And what was notable was that the more successful he became at making others laugh, the fewer opportunities he had to be seen authentically, because when someone has become a source of joy for others, people rarely think that person might also need comfort. And so the cycle continued repeating. He kept performing, kept pleasing, kept making everything look okay, while inside, the gap between those two people grew larger and larger. But there was still no sign it would stop, because up to that point, he still believed this was not only the best way, but perhaps the only way to survive in a world where he had learned very early that safety was never a given. When he stepped out of the school hallways and moved closer to the outside world, Will Smith carried with him something he had trained throughout his youth, not natural confidence, but the ability to make others feel comfortable when they were around him. And that very ability opened the first door into music when he met DJ Jazzy Jeff, a combination that seemed almost coincidental, but became a turning point. Two people with different styles found a common rhythm in each other, an energy strong enough to create something new. And very quickly, they were no longer just young guys performing on small stages, but became names mentioned in the hip-hop world. Their music carried a fun, approachable vibe, different from the edgy style that was popular at the time, helping them reach a wider audience. And then success came faster than either of them could imagine. The Grammy in 1989 was not just an award, but recognition that they had stepped into a position not everyone achieved, especially in a music genre still fighting for its place in the mainstream. For many people, that was the peak, the destination, proof that all the effort had been rewarded. But for Will, that feeling was not as complete as people thought. Because deep inside, what he carried from the past did not disappear when the stage lights came on. The fear of not being good enough, the worry of losing everything, was still there, only covered by the music and the applause. And instead of bringing peace, success forced him to face a new pressure. The pressure to hold on to what he had just achieved, the pressure not to be allowed to fail, the pressure to keep maintaining the image people had started to trust. And while everything on the outside seemed to be going in the right direction, inside, everything became more fragile. That showed most clearly when financial problems began to appear. Large incomes did not come with tight management. Inexperienced decisions led to money getting out of control. And then one day, reality hit without warning when the Internal Revenue Service began to intervene. The tax debts were no longer small numbers, but became a real burden, forcing him to face a truth no one had prepared for, that success did not mean safety, that standing at the top did not guarantee you would not fall. And for Will, that was not just a financial issue, but a replay of the fear he had tried to run from. The fear of losing control, the fear of not being able to protect what he had, the fear that everything he built could disappear in a short time. And in that situation, music, which had once been joy, gradually became a refuge, a space where he could temporarily forget the pressures weighing on him, where he could continue being the version everyone expected without having to face difficult questions about himself. But the more he used music as a way to escape reality, the fewer opportunities he had to understand what was really happening inside him. And the cycle continued. Success led to pressure, pressure led to fear. Fear led to searching for a place to hide, and music became the perfect tool for that. Not because it solved the problems, but because it helped him temporarily avoid looking straight at them. And while the world saw an artist rising, achieving milestones many dreamed of, the reality was that Will was running, not running toward success, but running away from what he had never truly understood about himself. And it was during this period that something important gradually took shape, that his goal had never been just success, but the feeling of safety he hoped success could bring. But what he had not realized then was that no level of success could replace facing himself. And as long as that had not happened, every achievement, no matter how big, was only a thin shell covering an insecurity that remained fully intact inside. While the financial pressure and the fear of losing control had not yet settled down, an opportunity appeared almost at exactly the moment Will Smith needed it most. An opportunity that not only changed his career, but also shaped his entire future self. That was when he stepped into the television world with The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, a show that at first was simply a role, but quickly became something much bigger, because the character he portrayed on screen was not a distant role, but almost an amplified version of the person he had built in real life. A funny, lively guy who always knew how to make everyone around him laugh, who always brought positive energy even in awkward situations. And that exact match meant he did not need to act in the usual way. He only needed to become the version the world wanted to see, something he had practiced since he was a child. And perhaps that was why this role was quickly embraced by audiences. Because it did not feel fake, there was no distance. It felt like they were seeing a real person, someone they could understand and love. And as time went on, that affection grew larger, bringing the success of the show and the financial stability he had been searching for so long. The debts gradually got resolved. The pressure from the Internal Revenue Service no longer weighed as heavily as before. And for the first time in a long while, everything seemed to be going in the right direction. But right in that stability, something else began to form. Something not easy to notice immediately. The line between his real self and the character on screen became increasingly hard to distinguish. Because when someone is constantly praised for a specific version of themselves, it is very easy for that person to start believing that is the only person they should be. And for Will, that happened gradually but surely. Every episode, every appearance, every positive reaction from the audience reinforced the idea that he had to continue being that person, had to continue maintaining that image, not only on screen but also in real life. And gradually, living according to other people's expectations became an inseparable part of his life, not because he wanted to be fake, but because he was no longer sure which part was truly him anymore. Because when you spend long enough becoming a version everyone loves, returning to yourself becomes harder than ever. And what was notable was that the success of the show not only brought fame, but also opened the door to Hollywood, where image and personal brand were almost as valuable as talent. And in that environment, maintaining a consistent image became necessary, causing the gap between the person inside and the person outside to continue widening. But it was still covered by success. Because when everything was working well, very few people had reason to stop and ask what the cost of that was. And for Will, this period was not only financial salvation, but also confirmation that the path he was on was right, that becoming the person others expected was the best way to move forward. But at the same time, it was when he began to live more for the audience, for expectations, for the image, and less for himself. And although that did not cause problems right away, it laid the foundation for a contradiction that would grow larger over time. A contradiction between who he was and who he had to be in order to keep everything he had built from collapsing. From the foundation that television provided, Will Smith stepped into Hollywood not as someone testing his luck, but as a person who already understood very clearly how attention worked. He was not just looking for roles, he was looking for position, looking for a place where he did not just exist, but could control the way he was perceived. And when the first opportunities came with big projects like Independence Day, and especially Men in Black, he did not just participate. He shaped the way his characters appeared, the way they talked, the way they reacted. Everything carried the mark of someone who had become too familiar with adjusting himself to fit the audience. And the result was success that came not just once, but repeated many times, turning him into one of the most reliable box office stars, a face that studios could bet hundreds of millions of dollars on without hesitation because he represented an image the public could easily embrace, a relatable hero who was humorous but still strong enough, someone audiences could trust to guide them through the story, and that very consistency made him a brand. Not just an actor, but a guarantee for success. But what few people saw was the cost of that consistency. Because when someone is loved for a specific image, they no longer have much room to change. Every choice had to be carefully considered. Every step had to fit what audiences had grown used to. And gradually, creative freedom was replaced by calculation. Not because of a lack of passion, but because there was too much to protect. Status, reputation, the trust of the audience. And in such an environment, failure was not just an unwanted outcome, but a risk that could affect the entire structure he had built. That created constant pressure, a feeling that there was no room for mistakes, that every project had to succeed, every appearance had to be right. And to ensure that, he not only worked harder but also controlled things more tightly, from scripts and visuals to promotion and the way he appeared in public. Everything was shaped to reinforce a consistent image, an image that over time became almost impossible to change. And while that helped him maintain his position at the top for many years, it also gradually created a gap between the real person and the person the world saw, because he did not always feel like the person he was portraying. He could not always maintain the positive energy everyone expected. But when that image had become part of the brand, showing anything different became harder. And so he continued being the person everyone needed him to be, continued keeping everything looking stable, even when inside it was not entirely so. And when he took on roles that demanded more depth, like in Ali, where he had to embody a complex character who was strong, but also full of contradictions, he did not just act. He brought parts of himself into it, parts he had perhaps never named. And that brought recognition from the industry, nominations, and praise. But it also made him realize that inside himself there were more layers than what he had allowed himself to show. And that realization did not always bring comfort, because it came with the question, if he was not always the person everyone saw, then who was he really? And when that question did not yet have a clear answer, returning to the familiar image became the safer choice, and the cycle continued. Success reinforced the image. The image created pressure. Pressure led to more control. And in that process, the feeling of being trapped in the perfect version he had created began to emerge, not as something sudden, but as a slow realization that everything was running smoothly but not completely free, that he was at the peak but not entirely comfortable. And that was not easy to admit, because from the outside there was no reason to doubt, no clear sign that something was wrong. Only a man continuing to succeed, continuing to be loved, continuing to deliver what audiences expected, while inside, a part of him began to wonder whether he was living his own life or simply maintaining a role that had lasted longer than any movie he had ever been in. And then, amid all the pressures of Hollywood, amid the movies, the contracts, and the carefully calculated images, Will Smith entered a relationship that he believed could give him what his career had never made him feel: completely, love, and a real family. When he married Jada Pinkett Smith, the world saw in them a perfect couple. Two talented, strong, independent people who still chose to walk together. They were not just husband and wife, but partners, people who built a family image that the public admired, a home where success and individuality seemed to blend naturally. And for many years, that image was maintained almost without cracks. Their joint appearances, their shared words about love and respect, all created a story that many believed was proof that two strong people could still find balance. But behind the moments captured in front of the cameras, the reality was much more complex. Because both Will and Jada were not people who easily fit into a mold. They both had their own views, their own perspectives on freedom, on attachment, on how a relationship should exist. And those differences, which at first could create attraction, over time became the source of quiet conflicts. Not big arguments that everyone could see, but differences in how they understood commitment, honesty, and how much a person could truly be themselves in a relationship. And while they tried to find a way to maintain connection without losing themselves, the pressure from the outside did not lessen. Because for the public, they were not just a couple but a symbol, a model. And that made every issue, small, large, more awkward. Because it was not just two people facing it, but millions of eyes watching, speculating, waiting for the perfect story to continue being maintained. And in that situation, keeping everything okay was no longer just a personal desire, but became a responsibility, something necessary to protect the image they had built. And that caused many real emotions to be held back, not because they did not exist, but because there was no safe space to express them. And over time, their relationship existed in a special state, where attachment and love were still present. But along with that were wounds that were not easy to name, distances that were not always filled, and a truth that both seemed to understand, that love was not always simple, not always fitting what society expected. And in the effort to keep the relationship going, they had to face questions that had no clear answers, had to accept that some things could not be resolved immediately, and had to learn to exist in a space where certainty was no longer a given. For Will, that was not just a challenge in marriage, but also a challenge to the very person he had built. Because while he always tried to control his image before the world, in this relationship there were things that could not be completely controlled, emotions that could not be arranged as he wished, and that forced him to face a part of himself that he had grown used to avoiding. The imperfect part, the vulnerable part, the part that could not always keep the smile. And it was in that inner struggle that the relationship was not a simple story of right or wrong, but a complex journey between holding on to each other and not losing themselves. A journey where love did not disappear, but also was not enough to erase all the cracks that had formed over time. From the effort to keep the relationship from completely collapsing under the weight of increasingly clear differences, Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith gradually stepped into a choice that not everyone understood, a way of redefining marriage in their own way, where traditional bonds were no longer the center, where each person was allowed to seek their own space, allowed to exist as an independent individual even while still connected to each other. And on the surface, that was called freedom, a modern approach, a maturity in the way of looking at love. But behind those explanations was a reality that was much more complex, because freedom did not always come with peace, and expanding the boundaries of a relationship did not mean that basic human emotions disappeared, did not mean that pain no longer existed. And for Will, this decision was not just a change in lifestyle, but a challenge to everything he believed about attachment, about protection, about his role in a family. Because deep inside, the part of him formed from childhood, from the memory of not being able to protect his mother, still existed, still craved control, still wanted to keep everything within reach. But the reality of this relationship went in the opposite direction, forcing him to accept things that his instincts did not easily accept. And in that acceptance, emotions like jealousy, hurt, and insecurity did not disappear. They only changed the way they appeared, becoming quieter, more discreet, harder to name, because when a person has chosen a path they believe is right, admitting that the path brings pain becomes difficult, not only in front of others, but also in front of themselves. And so Will continued keeping everything looking like a conscious choice, continued showing that he understood, that he agreed, that he was not affected, while inside there were questions that kept repeating, emotions that were not released, and a growing gap between what he said and what he truly felt. That did not happen in one day, but accumulated gradually over time, in small moments, in conversations that went nowhere, in times when both of them were in the same space but not truly connected. The silence between them was not peace, but the absence of things that needed to be said but were not said, because saying them could break what they were trying to hold together. And so they chose silence, chose to continue, chose to maintain a state where no one was truly satisfied, but no one was ready to change. And while their public life continued, with joint appearances and shared words about understanding and respect, Will's inner life went in a different direction, a direction few could see, where he had to handle on his own the emotions he could not share, could not show, because the image he had built had no room for that vulnerability, and the separation between these two worlds became increasingly clear. One side was the life in front of the cameras, where everything was still controlled, still shaped in a way the public could understand, and the other side was the inner life, where everything was unclear, had no script, had no easy way to resolve. And it was in that separation that the feeling of losing control began to appear. Not because he lacked the ability to control, but because there were things beyond that ability, things that could not be adjusted by will or effort. And for a person who had grown used to controlling the environment around him to avoid conflict, That was not easy to accept, and so he continued to call it freedom, continued to believe it was a conscious choice, because calling it something else could force him to face things he was not ready to face. And in that process, the two lives he had lived for many years, one where he was the man the world admired, and one where he struggled with emotions no one saw, grew further apart, no longer just two sides of the same person, but two parallel realities existing at the same time, but never truly meeting. And when that gap became large enough, keeping the two from colliding became a job that demanded a lot of energy, a lot of restraint, and a lot of silence, things that from the outside no one could see, but that deeply shaped the way he lived, the way he loved, and the way he understood himself. And when the inner life became increasingly complex, Will Smith found a different meaning in the role of being a father, a role he believed could help him repair what the past had left behind. When Jaden Smith and Willow Smith entered his life, not just as children who needed care, but as an opportunity for him to become the person he had once needed when he was small, a father who did not impose, did not create fear, did not force his children to live by rigid patterns, and so he chose a path that was almost completely opposite to the way he had been raised. He wanted his children to be free, to explore, to express themselves without limits, an environment where creativity was encouraged, where emotions were accepted, where there were no heavy silences like the ones he had experienced. And in the early years, that brought a different family image, a family where the children were not just the kids of a star, but individuals with their own voices and the right to choose their own paths. But that very freedom, when placed in the context of a public that was always watching, became a controversial topic, because not everyone understood what he was doing. Not everyone agreed with letting the children be exposed to the spotlight from a very early age, or with decisions that many considered too mature for their age. And criticism began to appear, not only aimed at the way he raised his children, but also questioning whether he was going too far in his effort to avoid repeating his father's mistakes. And for Will, that was not easy, because he had to face not only outside opinions, but also ask himself whether what he was doing was truly right. Because between protecting his children and giving them freedom, there existed a very thin line, and there was no clear formula to determine where that line was. There were times he believed that letting them decide for themselves would make them stronger and more independent, but there were also times he realized that that freedom came with risks they were not always ready to face. And in moments like those, he had to turn back to himself, to the memories of his childhood, to what he had lacked, to what he had endured, and tried to find a balance between two seemingly opposing things, not repeating what he had gone through, and not unintentionally creating new difficulties for his children, and that was not always successful. There were decisions that later, when he looked back, made him wonder if he could have done differently. There were moments when he realized that no matter how hard he tried, being a father was not only about intention, but also about understanding, about listening, about accepting that he was not always right. And it was in that process that a realization gradually formed, that love, no matter how strong, does not automatically lead to the right decisions, that loving his children does not mean always knowing what is best for them, and that did not diminish the value of love but only made it more real, more complex, and sometimes more painful, because it forced a person to face their own limits, to accept that there are things they cannot control, lessons their children must experience on their own, and moments when the role of a father is not to fix everything, but to be there, to listen, and to accept that each person's journey is different. And in all of that, Will was not only raising his children, but also relearning how to understand family, love, and himself, in a process with no clear ending, where every day brought new questions, new challenges, and a constant effort to become a better father, even when he was not always sure he was heading in the right direction. And while the world continued to see in Will Smith an increasingly perfect image, a man who had reached the pinnacle of his career with global recognition, major roles, prestigious awards, and long rounds of applause from Hollywood to everywhere around the world, inside him there began to emerge a feeling that he could not easily name, a vague emptiness but large enough to make everything around him become blurred, because after all that he had achieved, after the years of relentless effort to become the person everyone expected, he realized that the sense of security he had once sought in success had never truly arrived. The milestones he had conquered did not bring the peace he had imagined. And in the moments without the lights, without the cameras, without anyone watching, he began to face a hard-to-accept truth, that maybe he had built so many things on the outside but had never truly touched the inside. And that was not easy to admit, especially for a person who was used to controlling everything, used to always having the answer. But this time, there was no formula that could be applied, no role that could help him get through it. And so he began to search, not in his career, but within himself, turning to methods he had never thought of before. From reading books, participating in sharing sessions, to trying new approaches in understanding the mind and emotions, he tried to decode what was happening inside, tried to understand why, even with everything, he still felt something was missing. And in that process, the old fears began to return, not in the clear form as when he was a child, but in the form of questions, worries about losing what he had, about whether his family was truly solid, about whether the image he had built was the only thing keeping everything standing, and if one day that image was broken, what would be left? Those questions did not have immediate answers, but they forced him to look back, to reconsider the way he had lived, the way he had defined success, and the way he had traded to achieve those things, and gradually, a realization began to form, not like a clear conclusion, but like an increasingly strong feeling that what he had built on the outside, no matter how impressive, could not replace understanding and accepting himself, that no level of success could fill a void that he himself had never truly faced, and that did not diminish the value of what he had achieved, but it changed the way he perceived them, from goals to be achieved into parts of a larger journey, a journey that he had not fully understood. And while the world continued to applaud, continued to call his name like a symbol, then, for Will, those sounds were no longer enough to cover the silence inside, a silence that forced him to listen to himself in a way that he had avoided for many years. And it was in that listening that he began to realize that the hardest thing was not achieving success, but facing what success could not solve, the parts of himself that no one else could see. But that determined how he truly lived, truly felt, and truly understood himself. And then came a night when all that had been held back, all that had been suppressed over many years, seemed to find an escape, not in a private room, not in a discreet conversation, but right on the biggest stage of the film industry, at the Oscars, where Will Smith stepped in as a strong contender, a man who had waited for this moment for many years. And as the ceremony unfolded, everything seemed to still follow the familiar script, the lights, the laughter, the host's lines, until Chris Rock stepped onto the stage and made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith, a line that in another context might have just been part of the show, but in that moment, with everything that had built up inside, it was no longer that simple. And in just a few seconds, a decision was made, with no time to think, no pause to consider. Will stood up, walked onto the stage, and the action happened in front of millions of people. A slap, not a movie scene, not part of a script, but a real moment. A moment where the entire auditorium seemed unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Silence enveloped everything. Not a normal silence, but a void where people tried to understand what had just happened, where no one knew how to react, because the image they were familiar with, the man who always had control, always stayed calm, always knew how to handle every situation, had just done something completely opposite to everything they believed about him. And when Will returned to his seat, the emotions still had not stopped. The words that were spoken were no longer controlled as before, no longer measured as usual. but carried a rare outburst in public. And it was in that very moment that the difference between the person he had shown for many years and the real person inside was no longer kept hidden. It appeared clearly, undeniable, uneditable, irretrievable, and for many people, it was a shock. A collapse of the image they had associated with the name Will Smith. But for him himself, it was not a separate moment, but the result of a long process, a chain of unresolved emotions, unreleased pressures, memories that had never been fully processed, from the night he stood watching without being able to protect his mother, to the years of having to maintain a perfect image, to the conflicts in his marriage, to the feeling of losing control that he had tried to call by other names. All of that did not disappear. It had only been held back, and when there was no more space to contain it, it found a way out, not in the way he wanted, but in the way it could. And that night became the intersection of all of that, a moment where the past and the present were no longer separate, where an action in the present carried the weight of many years of accumulation. And what made that moment so hard to understand for many people was not the action itself, but the fact that it came from a person they believed always had control over himself. And that very surprise highlighted a truth that had not been clear before, that the image he had built, no matter how strong, could not completely eliminate the other parts of him, the imperfect parts, the vulnerable parts, the parts that could react in ways that even he could not foresee. And after that moment, even though the ceremony continued, even though he still walked up to receive the award, even though the speeches were still given, nothing was the same anymore. Because once an image had been cracked, it could not return to its original state completely. And for Will, that was not just facing the reaction from the outside, but also facing himself, with the question of what had led to that moment, what had made him, the person who had spent his whole life controlling, maintaining, keeping everything looking stable, unable to do that in such an important moment. And the answer, though not simple, lay in everything he had been through, in everything he had tried to hold back, in everything he had not allowed himself to face until they could no longer be held back, and in one brief moment, everything became clearer than ever. After that moment, when the lights of the ceremony gradually dimmed and the applause gave way to discussions, the world no longer looked at Will Smith the same way. What had once been near absolute admiration was now replaced by questions, controversies, and intense reactions spreading across the media, from news programs, social networks to everyday conversations. The action on stage was no longer a separate moment, but became the focus of a wave of evaluations, where each person had their own view, their own perspective, their own judgment, and among them not a few opinions carried disappointment, even turning away, because for many people the image they had once trusted had been broken, not just by an action, but by the meaning they attached to that action. The criticisms did not stop at analyzing right or wrong, but went further, raising questions about the whole person he was, about what he represented, about whether what he had shown for many years was real or not, and, while before, each of his appearances usually came with welcome, now every news related to him brought a wave of reactions, not always positive, not always forgiving. A part of the audience stayed, still trying to understand, but another part left, no longer looking at him with the old eyes, and that created a clear change in the way he was received, from an almost infallible symbol to a human being who had to take responsibility for what he had done. And in that context, continuing to appear as if nothing had happened was no longer an option, because everything had changed, not only on the outside, but also on the inside, and so he withdrew, not as a media strategy, but as a natural response to a situation where he needed time to understand, to process, to face it. That period was not noisy. There were no constant appearances, no immediate efforts to repair the image, but a prolonged silence, a quiet space in which he had to face the consequences of his own action, not only what the public said, but also what he said to himself. Questions about responsibility, about control, about why such a moment had happened, and in that process, a feeling of isolation gradually appeared, not because he was completely alone, but because the position he had once stood in had changed. When a person who was used to being loved, supported, welcomed, facing silence or skepticism from the outside could create a gap that was hard to fill. The relationships were still there. The family was still by his side, but the feeling of how he was perceived in the larger world was no longer the same, and that forced him to adapt to a new reality, where he was no longer the person everyone would default to supporting, but a person who had to accept that trust, once shaken, needed time to be rebuilt, and might never return to the way it was. And in that circumstance, the hardest thing was not facing the criticisms, but accepting that his action had created consequences that could not simply be erased, that some things had happened that could not be reversed, and that the only way to move forward was not to deny or justify, but to understand, accept, and take responsibility. And that process did not happen quickly. There was no clear endpoint, but a long journey where each day carried a part of facing himself with what had happened and with the question of who he would become after all of that. A question that no one else could answer for him. And in that prolonged silence, when the noises from the outside gradually subsided, Will Smith began to do what he had avoided for many years, not appearing to explain or defend his image, but stopping to truly look at what had happened, not just in the moment on stage, but in the entire journey leading to that moment. And when he chose to speak up, not with a carefully prepared statement to calm public opinion, but with a public apology, what mattered was not what he said, but the way he acknowledged that he had been wrong, that the action could not be justified, and that he had to take responsibility for what he had done. That was a step he had rarely had to take in such a direct way before, because for most of his life, he had been used to controlling the narrative, used to shaping the way he was perceived. But this time, he could not do that, and that very inability forced him to approach everything in a different way, a way that did not rely on maintaining the image, but on understanding himself. And when he began to look back, not just the past few years, but the entire journey from when he was still a child in a house full of silence and tension, through the years of building a version that always pleased others, through the successes in music, television, and film, through the relationships, the choices, the moments when he had tried to keep everything under control, all of it gradually connected in a way that he had never seen clearly before. And what he realized was not a simple truth, but a chain of connections between what he had experienced and the way he reacted to the world. That the fears from childhood did not disappear, but only changed form. That always trying to become the perfect person was not a sign of strength, but sometimes a way to avoid facing the weak parts, and that living two lives, one for the world and one for himself, could not last forever without creating consequences. And it was in that process that he began to learn something he had never truly practiced before, which was acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of giving up, but acceptance that he was not perfect, that he could be wrong, that he had parts that were not easy to acknowledge, but were still part of who he was. And that did not make him less valuable, but only made him more real. And as that acceptance gradually formed, the way he looked at what was important in life also changed. Instead of focusing on maintaining an image in front of the public, he began to direct his attention to closer relationships, to family, to moments without cameras, where he could exist without needing to perform, and in that space, he had the opportunity to look back at his role, not only as an artist, but as a husband, a father, a human being with his own limits and abilities. And finding the balance between the real person and the outside image was not an immediate transformation, but a process that required time, that required patience, because when a person had been used to living according to the expectations of others, returning to himself could feel uncertain, even difficult. But it was in that uncertainty that he began to find a different kind of freedom. Not freedom defined by doing whatever he wanted, but freedom to be himself without needing to hide. And that did not mean everything became perfect, did not mean the problems disappeared, but only meant that he was approaching them in a different way, a more honest way, less defensive. And in that process, the image the world once knew did not completely disappear. But it was no longer the only thing that defined him. Because, for the first time in a long time, he was not just acting, but trying to live, with everything that came with it. Both the easy parts and the difficult parts. Both the things that could be shared and the things that still needed time to understand better. And when looking back at that entire journey, from a boy growing up in a house where silence was often heavier than words, to a man standing on the biggest stages in the world, Will Smith was no longer a story about a straight path from hardship to success, but a complex journey where every step forward came with things that had to be traded, where every achievement carried a part of what had been left behind. He had achieved things that very few people could achieve, from music, television to film. From the early days of finding his place to becoming one of the most influential faces in American pop culture, the awards, the roles, the memorable moments, all created a legacy that no one could deny. But at the same time, that journey also came with pressures, fears, conflicts that were not always seen. The years of having to maintain a perfect image, the moments of having to stay silent instead of speaking up, the decisions made not only based on personal desires, but also on the expectations of millions of people. And when looking back, what became clear was not how successful he had been, but how much he had carried to achieve that. And what was remarkable was that even with moments when everything seemed to collapse, even with times when the image he built was questioned, he still did not stop, did not disappear, but continued. Not in the old way, not with the same level of control or the same image, but in a different way, slower, truer, and perhaps also more difficult, because standing up after an incident was not just continuing to work or continuing to appear, but facing what had happened, learning to understand why it happened, and accepting that there were parts of himself that needed to be looked at again. And it was in that process that his resilience did not lie in never stumbling, but in not giving up after stumbling, in continuing to question himself, continuing to seek balance between what he had been and what he wanted to become. And that was not a journey with a clear endpoint, but a continuous process, where each stage carried new lessons, new challenges, and a deeper level of understanding about himself. And perhaps that was the most important part in his story. Not just what he had achieved, but the way he had changed, had adapted, had learned from his experiences, both the good things and the difficult things. And when looking at the legacy he left behind, it did not only lie in the movies, the songs, or the awards, but also in the story of a man who had spent most of his life trying to become the version the world expected, and then at one point began to learn how to become himself, a process that was not easy, not perfect, but authentic. And that very authenticity made his story not just the story of a star, but the story of anyone who had ever felt they had to become something else to be accepted, and then gradually realized that the hardest thing was not achieving recognition, but accepting themselves with all their imperfect parts and continuing to live with that understanding, not as a conclusion, but as a journey that was still ongoing. Will Smith's story is not just the journey of a star, but a very human tragedy hidden behind the spotlight that he himself had built. When looking back in detail at the night he stood helplessly watching his mother being hurt, without being able to intervene, we understand that the feeling of not enough had formed very early and silently followed him throughout his life, then grew into the pressure to become the perfect person, the person who always had control over everything. His becoming the class clown, always making others laugh, was not an expression of happiness, but a survival mechanism, and that continued to repeat throughout his career. From the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air to blockbusters like Men in Black, where he not only played a character, but also played the very person the world wanted to see. That is why the moment at the Oscars when he slapped Chris Rock was not a single impulsive action, but the breaking point of a pressure that had been suppressed for too long. A moment when the perfect shell was no longer strong enough to hide the cracks inside. What makes this story poignant is not that he was wrong, but that he had to live for so long without being allowed to be himself. But it is also right there that his story becomes worthy of respect, because after all, he did not disappear, did not deny, but faced it, apologized and started over, something not everyone has the courage to do when they are at the peak. For the American people, where success is often measured by image and achievements, this story is a reminder that no perfection can replace being honest with oneself, and that real strength does not lie in never falling, but in daring to look back, daring to change, and continuing to live more authentically. If this story makes you think about the things hidden behind a familiar smile, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to show respect for his journey, full of wounds but unyielding. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that few dare to tell.